China calls it the YJ-21. The Pentagon calls it a carrier killer, a hypersonic missile that can strike at more than Mach 10, leaving billion-dollar warships with seconds to react, or they'll disappear beneath the waves. For decades, US aircraft carriers have ruled the seas, but the YJ-21 threatens to change that balance of power. Its real range is classified, its capabilities debated, and its existence signals one thing: the Pacific is entering a new era of naval warfare. So what makes this missile so dangerous? And is it any surprise that a sense of existential dread is being felt from Tokyo to Washington? The carrier problem. Since the end of World War II, aircraft carriers have stood as the cornerstone of US military dominance on the oceans. The emergence of the aircraft carrier signaled the end of the battleship, as it took on the role of the new flagship for navies, wielding the ability to project air power well beyond the visible horizon. Every US supercarrier resembles a massive floating city, stretching over 1,000 feet in length and housing more than 70 aircraft. These formidable vessels can launch strikes or provide support for operations worldwide. The United States operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, a feat unmatched by any other nation in terms of carrier tonnage or global presence. Throughout every crisis since 1945, a common refrain among US leaders has been, "Where are the carriers?" which was a clear indication of the carrier's role as a vital instrument for demonstrating power. Therefore, the presence of US carrier strike groups represents a significant challenge for China. Beijing, you have a problem. Consider China's position here. It holds significant stakes in the surrounding waters in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, while American carrier groups can glide right into those regions armed with jets capable of targeting the mainland or stepping into a regional dispute. In the event of a Taiwan crisis, US carriers might find themselves strategically positioned off the Chinese coast, treaty-bound to defend the island against an attack by China. This is the scenario that China military strategists are keen to avert. In Chinese military speak, the concept of A2AD stands for anti-access area denial. This strategy is designed to prevent adversarial forces, like US aircraft carriers, from entering your territory. If the US concludes that it cannot afford to place its carriers within the reach of China's arsenal, then China has essentially barred the US from entering the disputed area. In the last 20 years, China has poured resources into developing an A2AD arsenal, aiming to drive US carriers and warships further from its coastline. This encompasses a wide variety of anti-ship cruise missiles deployed on aircraft, vessels, and submarines, in addition to land-based long-range ballistic missiles specifically engineered to target ships on the ocean. The presence of these carrier killer weapons compels the US Navy to reconsider its strategy when it comes to deploying carriers near Chinese waters, particularly during tense situations involving Taiwan or contested islands. China has made its stance unmistakably clear. The time when US carriers could operate without challenge off of the coast of East Asia has come to an end. Once regarded as nearly invincible emblems of supremacy, American carriers are now facing a concerted effort from Beijing to shift that narrative. At the heart of China's strategy is a new breed of missiles built to send carriers straight to the ocean floor. Enter the YJ-21. China's development of the YJ-21 was surrounded in secrecy for years. Military analysts long suspected Beijing was working on a ship-launched hypersonic missile, but confirmation only came very recently. The first public reveal occurred in late 2021 when observers at the Zhuhai Air Show caught sight of a mysterious new weapon on display. The real showcase, though, came in April 2022 on the eve of the PLA Navy's 73rd anniversary. Chinese state media at that point released footage of a Type 055 Renhai-class cruiser, a massive 13,000-ton stealth destroyer, test-firing a missile from its vertical launch tubes. Analysts quickly identified it as the long-rumored YJ-21. Once regarded as a shadowy project, the missile was suddenly a very real and very operational system. So, what exactly is it? Well, the name stands for Yingji, or Eagle Strike 21. It is a hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile, a hybrid between a ballistic missile and a cruise weapon designed specifically to target large ships. Compact enough to fit into the universal vertical launch cells of Chinese destroyers, it reportedly measures about 8 to 9 meters long. Variants are also believed to exist. An air-launched version called the KD-21 can be carried by China's H-6K bombers, giving it even greater reach. In terms of performance, the YJ-21 is claimed to fly at hypersonic speeds, estimated around Mach 6 in cruise, accelerating up to as much as Mach 10, 10 times the speed of sound, or 8,000 miles per hour during its terminal dive. At those speeds, a missile launched from 1,500 kilometers away could hit a carrier in minutes, leaving commanders only seconds to respond. Even worse, these weapons can change course mid-flight. Instead of following a predictable ballistic arc, the YJ-21 likely carries a hypersonic glide vehicle capable of shifting course in flight. This makes interception extremely difficult, if not impossible, with existing defenses. Designed explicitly to hunt carriers, the YJ-21 represents a bold threat. China now has a weapon built to destroy America's most prized warships. How a carrier killer works. Now, to understand why the YJ-21 has drawn so much attention, it helps to compare it to traditional anti-ship missiles and the challenge of hitting a moving carrier in the open ocean. For decades, navies relied on weapons like the American Harpoon or French Exocet. These sea-skimming cruise missiles fly low and subsonic, around Mach 0.8, before popping up near their target to strike. They proved deadly in past conflicts. For example, an Exocet famously sank HMS Sheffield during the 1982 Falklands War, but modern warships are now equipped with layered defenses, including radars, surface-to-air missiles, and rapid-fire CIWS guns, which can usually neutralize such threats. Now, later generations raise the stakes by going even faster. Missiles such as India's and Russia's BrahMos or China's YJ-12 reach supersonic speeds of Mach 2 to 3 in their terminal approach. At that velocity, defenders have less than half the reaction time compared to a subsonic missile. Even one hit becomes harder to stop. Yet these weapons still travel at only a few times the speed of sound, and they typically cover ranges of a few hundred kilometers. Hypersonic missiles like the YJ-21 are an entirely different category. At Mach 5 and above, they move so fast that they blur the line between cruise and ballistic missiles. A ballistic missile, like China's older DF-21D, arcs high into the atmosphere, making it visible to radar long before impact. A hypersonic boost glide weapon, however, flies much lower and later pops over the horizon, leaving defenders perhaps a minute to react instead of several. Unlike a predictable ballistic arc, a hypersonic glide vehicle can maneuver during flight, weaving unpredictably and making intercept calculations nearly impossible. Even advanced systems such as the US Navy's Aegis with SM-6 interceptors struggles against a target diving at Mach 10 on a shifting course. Defensive projects like lasers, improved interceptors, or electronic jamming may help, but the reaction window is still vanishingly small. The YJ-21's effectiveness also depends on the kill chain. Locating and tracking a carrier across the vast Pacific requires satellites, over-the-horizon radar, and drones feeding data to command centers. Mid-course updates guide the missile, while its glide warhead likely uses radar or infrared seekers to find the ship in its final dive. The system is complex, yet China has invested heavily in the surveillance and communications infrastructure needed to make it work. In short, YJ-21 is not a standalone wonder weapon, but the sharp edge of a much larger strike network. If all functions as intended, it could hit a moving carrier before its crew even realize what's coming. The history of China's anti-carrier weapons. The thing is, China didn't develop the YJ-21 in isolation. It is the product of decades of steady work aimed at countering US aircraft carriers. A major breakthrough came during the 1995 to 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the United States sailed carriers near Taiwan to signal resolve. Beijing could do little in response, and that power imbalance was a wake-up call. From then on, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, began investing heavily in ways to hold carriers at risk. In the early years, China relied on relatively short-range anti-ship cruise missiles. The YJ-83, similar to the US Harpoon, was among the first. By the 2000s, more advanced types appeared. The YJ-12, an air-launched missile, could sprint to Mach 3 during its final approach. The YJ-18, launched from ships or submarines, traveled stealthily at subsonic speed before surging to Mach 2.5 near impact. These weapons gave the PLA the ability to saturate carriers' layered defenses with fast, low-flying threats, which were a dangerous prospect for even the most advanced fleet. But the real revolution came with anti-ship ballistic missiles, or ASBMs. In the mid-2000s, China revealed the DF-21D, the world's first ballistic missile designed to hit moving ships at sea. Nicknamed the Carrier Killer, it had a range of roughly 1,500 kilometers and was believed to carry a maneuverable warhead. By around 2010, it was thought to be operational, and reports in 2013 suggested it had been tested against a target the size of a carrier. The message was very clear: China could now strike a carrier very far offshore. Shortly afterward, the PLA introduced the DF-26, dubbed the Guam Killer, with a range of about 4,000 kilometers, enough to reach US bases or carriers operating well beyond the first island chain. Both missiles exemplified asymmetric warfare, relatively inexpensive weapons threatening some of the most costly and visible symbols of US power. Meanwhile, the Navy continued to improve its ship-launched systems. The YJ-18 became standard on modern destroyers and submarines, while H-6 bombers carried heavy loads of YJ-12s to extend China's reach even further out to sea. By the late 2010s, the PLA had built a layered anti-ship arsenal across land, sea, and air. The YJ-21 builds directly on this foundation. It takes the speed and reach of the DF-21D, adds hypersonic glide technology for evasiveness, and packages it into a missile that can be launched from ships or bombers. Some trace its lineage to the earlier CM-401, a short-range ballistic anti-ship missile with similar concepts. With the YJ-21, however, China now has an operational hypersonic weapon that could be deployed at sea. Analysts have gone so far as to describe Type 055 destroyers armed with YJ-21s as the most powerful surface warships in the world in terms of firepower. This is the culmination of decades of effort. Instead of trying to outbuild the US in carriers, China has sought to make the waters around it too dangerous for those carriers to enter. Therefore, the YJ-21 represents the sharp edge of that strategy. How the world reacted. The advent of the YJ-21 and similar Chinese missiles has not gone unnoticed, and it has rattled militaries across the globe. The United States Navy, which has relied on carrier strike groups as the backbone of its power projection for decades, publicly maintains confidence in its ability to handle the threat. Officials remind observers that carriers never sail alone, and they are always accompanied by cruisers and destroyers equipped with advanced Aegis defense systems, surface-to-air missiles, and other protective measures. A carrier strike group, they argue, is a floating fortress with multiple layers of defenses designed to destroy incoming missiles before they ever reach the flagship. American commanders also emphasize that new defenses are being developed specifically to deal with hypersonic weapons. Investments are pouring into better sensors, faster interceptors, electronic warfare systems, and even directed energy weapons such as lasers. The message is clear: the carrier is not finished. US admirals point out that throughout history, carriers have repeatedly been declared obsolete, from the rise of the submarine to the appearance of Soviet cruise missiles, and yet they adapted and remained central. They believe the same will be true in the hypersonic era. Not everyone is convinced, though. Independent analysts and retired officers have warned that the Navy must adapt quickly to the new reality. A 2023 war game by the Center for Strategic and International Studies simulated a conflict over Taiwan. The US prevailed, but at enormous cost, including the loss of 2 aircraft carriers. Retired officers caution that in peer conflict, the Navy should expect to lose carriers. That prospect, unthinkable in recent decades, is prompting serious debate in Washington about how to project power in the Pacific. Should carriers operate farther from China's shores? Should they rely on long-range drones or stealth aircraft? Should submarines, which are immune to anti-ship ballistic missiles, take on a much larger share of the mission? America's allies are also responding. Taiwan, the likeliest flashpoint, worries about what happens if US carriers hesitate to close in. Japan has begun developing a new long-range anti-ship missile with a range of up to 2,000 kilometers, designed specifically to counter weapons like the YJ-21. This represents a dramatic shift for a country once bound by strict limits on offensive capabilities. Australia, too, is reinforcing its defenses, acquiring nuclear-powered submarines and long-range strike weapons to ensure it can contribute if carriers are forced to keep their distance. Even if the YJ-21 remains only partially deployed, its very existence has changed naval calculations. Admirals must now plan for the possibility of unstoppable missiles raining down on their most valuable ships. And that, in strategic terms, may be its greatest effect, reshaping behavior without ever being launched. Arms race and comparisons. So the YJ-21, it's not an isolated marvel. It's part of a broader contest unfolding across the world. Hypersonic weapons have become the new benchmark of military prestige, with Russia, China, the United States, and several others vying for the lead. Each breakthrough by one nation compels the others to accelerate their own programs, fueling an arms race reminiscent of the Cold War missile competitions. Russia has been especially eager to showcase its capabilities. Its air-launched Kinzhal missile, essentially a modified ballistic weapon, can reportedly reach Mach 10. While aimed mainly at land targets, it could theoretically be turned against naval forces. More relevant to China's YJ-21 is Russia's 3M-22 Zircon, a ship-launched hypersonic cruise missile that President Putin has presented as a point of national pride. With a claimed speed near Mach 9 and a range of roughly 1,000 kilometers, the Zircon has been test-fired from both frigates and submarines. In 2023, the Admiral Gorshkov became the first warship to deploy with the weapon, even embarking on a high-profile Atlantic voyage. Reports during the Ukraine war hinted, though without confirmation, that the Zircon had seen actual combat use. By contrast, the United States has struggled to field comparable systems. Its Air Force centerpiece, the AGM-183 ARRW, promised a Mach 5+ strike capability, but it was cancelled in 2023 after repeated test failures. Other projects remain in development, scramjet-powered concepts such as HAWC and HACM, and the Army-Navy's joint LRHW conventional prompt strike program. These weapons are primarily intended for land attack missions, leaving a gap in dedicated anti-ship options. Only recently has the Navy launched the HALO initiative, aiming for a hypersonic anti-ship missile deployable by aircraft sometime around 2030. In the meantime, the US relies on subsonic weapons like the Harpoon, the Naval Strike Missile, and the stealthy but subsonic LRASM. This reliance places US carrier groups at a disadvantage compared to China's growing arsenal of high-speed, long-range strike weapons. Other nations are working to close the gap as well. India, in partnership with Russia, is developing the BrahMos 2, expected to achieve Mach 7 with a range of roughly 1,500 kilometers. France and Japan also maintain hypersonic research programs, though these remain experimental. The pattern is clear. China's deployment of the YJ-21 has helped push rivals to quicken their pace. Russia's combat use of hypersonics shows they are not theoretical, and while questions remain about their effectiveness under wartime conditions, one reality is beyond dispute. Against a ship at sea, hypersonic weapons present a threat unlike anything navies have ever faced before. The strategic implications. Now, the emergence of the YJ-21 forces navies to reconsider how they fight at sea. For decades, the aircraft carrier has been the undisputed symbol of maritime power, but hypersonic carrier killers raise new questions about its future role. The debate now centers on whether carriers can adapt once more, or whether they are finally facing a threat that changes the balance for good. And all of this leads to a central question. Are aircraft carriers, the pride of navies for 80 years, becoming obsolete in the face of weapons like the YJ-21? And this debate divides strategists. Carriers have endured submarines, anti-ship missiles, and even the nuclear age, adapting each time. The US Navy insists this platform will continue, pointing to new tactics such as dispersing forces, using standoff weapons, and developing distributed maritime operations. In this model, power is spread across smaller ships, drones, and unmanned vessels, making the fleet harder to strike. Future carriers may carry more drones than manned aircraft, evolving rather than vanishing. Yet China's approach highlights a harsher reality. In economic terms, it is far cheaper to build waves of hypersonic missiles than it is to replace a $15 billion carrier. US planners worry that in a prolonged conflict, Beijing could afford to trade salvos for carriers and come out ahead. That concern is driving new investments in nuclear-powered attack submarines, agile basing concepts, and long-range strike options. Even ships like the USS Zumwalt are being converted to carry hypersonic missiles, underscoring the urgency here. Beyond cost, there's also escalation. If China ever sank a US carrier, the loss of thousands of lives would echo as modern Pearl Harbor, almost certain to trigger overwhelming retaliation. For that reason, many analysts see the YJ-21 less as a battlefield weapon and more as a deterrent and a psychological lever meant to make US leaders hesitate in a Taiwan crisis. So carriers then, they're not dead, but their supremacy is under challenge, as it's never been under challenge before. An aircraft carrier reduced to a burning wreck within minutes by a missile launched from far away. It's a vision that has not become reality, but the YJ-21 forces navies to treat it as a possibility. Is it truly revolutionary, or is it largely psychological? Well, think about this. The YJ-21, it doesn't need to hit a single carrier to change the game. It's shadows enough. Navies now plan around a missile that may never be fired, wargamed into every decision by its mere existence. And that's the real power here, forcing admirals to rethink strategy before a shot is even taken. And that uncertainty is the point. Weapons like the YJ-21 shape strategy by their existence alone, altering calculations without being fired. They embody a new era where hypersonic speed, maneuverability, and range redefine naval balance. For now, US aircraft carriers remain as the apex of force projection. but their dominance has never faced a challenge as direct and as dangerous as this. Thank you for watching.